Welcome to a special Halloween episode of Draw This. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to draw a sugar skull. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll be using Corel Painter 2016 today. I'm going to start with this skull template. I created this skull last Halloween, and there's a tutorial you can watch on my channel to learn how to create this skull from scratch. And this is just one of the files we used as a visual aid. So I've gone ahead and loaded this as a reference image on its own layer here into Corel Painter 2016. You could use Corel Painter 2015 or Corel Painter X3 as well to follow along. If you're a member of my Patreon community, I'll give you access to this sugar skull template file if you want to work from this. Or you can go ahead and follow my skull tutorial, create the skull, and then come back to this one, load it into a composition, and then what we'll want to do is we'll want to create a new layer for ink. And then I'm going to turn on symmetry or mirror painting. I'm going to drag from the center dot here to try to center this as best I can. I think that looks pretty centered. And then it's important from this point on that we don't move this guide left or right, or it's going to mess up our symmetry. So now we can go ahead and begin painting. We'll select the scratchboard tool and we can choose a brush size. I'm going to hold Ctrl and Alt on my keyboard and drag out a size manually. I think something like that will work pretty well. So it's important to note that you can draw on both sides of this skull here. So you can see if I draw on the left or on the right, it's going to mirror it on both sides. So what we want is a nice smooth line, and we don't have to do this all in one solid line. We can do this in segments. So I'm going to do this particular line here this way. And then I'm going to do this particular line this way. And just try to finish it out like so. And it's up to you what kind of shape you want to make for your skull here. I'm just going to follow what's here, but you could change all of these proportions around. These are just kind of generic skull proportions. And it's up to you how you want to stylize your skull. You could stylize it differently than what I've done here. I think something like that looks kind of cool. Maybe I'll just connect the eyes all the way like this. Now we can go ahead and use the eyeball here to hide the reference layer. And I've gone ahead and turned the canvas off to make it invisible because we're going to want to end up with something that has a transparent background. So for now we'll go ahead and click the eyeball to turn the canvas layer back on so we can see a white background and we can see what our skull looks like so far. So we have our ink on a layer. We can also put our colors on a layer beneath the ink. And that way we don't have to worry about coloring over the lines. So let's click on the reference layer. Let's create a new layer above that, which will be below the ink. Make sure the ink is always on top of your color layers. And let's rename that layer Skull. This will just be the main color of the skull. And we can pick any color that we want. This doesn't even have to be your final color, but just pick a nice bright color that you can see on that white background so that you can easily fill this in. Obviously, if you were going to paint a white skull, if your background is white, you're not going to be able to see what you're doing when you're painting, unless you change the background color or you pick a different color other than white. So what I've done is just painted right along the edge with this scratchboard tool, because that's really the most important part. We can actually fill in the middle pretty easily using the paint bucket tool. And if we click, we can fill in that skull. And that's a much quicker way to do it. Now the way that this paint bucket works is it has to have a closed shape to fill. So I'm going to select the brush tool and I'll show you what I mean by that. If I don't draw a closed shape, this is an open shape up on the top, this is a closed shape on the bottom. If I select that paint bucket tool and I fill the closed shape, it'll fill. If I try to fill the open shape, the paint goes outside of that shape and goes everywhere. So if you're trying to fill your skull and the paint's going all over your canvas, you may want to hide the eyeball on your ink layer and check to make sure that you had a closed shape. Now let's go ahead and save a copy of our artwork. We'll go to Save As. And I usually save as a PSD format because I like to work between Photoshop and Painter. But today I'm going to save this as a RIF. You can call it Sugar Skull or whatever you like. I'm using the Adobe RGB color profile, so I have this checked. But you could use any color profile you want. I'm going to click on Save. Let's switch back to our scratchboard tool. And let's create some additional layers for color. We'll want these layers to be above the skull layer. So let's call this eyes, nose, mouth. These will be all the inner parts of the skull. And then we'll create one more layer and we'll call that teeth. Let's go to the eyes, nose, mouth layer. Let's pick a darker color. Let's go ahead and zoom in here. And you're probably wondering, why can't you just use the paint bucket to go in on the ink layer and just fill? You can do that, and that works fine. The only problem is that color and that ink are on the same layer, and you may decide later that you want to change the color of one of those components. It's a lot easier to change if your color is on its own layer. So if I go to that eyes, nose, mouth layer and I just paint just like I did before, just concentrating on the edges, then I can easily fill in the center after the fact with the paint bucket. Now the paint bucket only works on one side of the symmetry, so you'll have to click on both sides. Occasionally you might find some little spots here that didn't get filled in. Like that happened with my scratchboard tool up here and here in my paint, so I'll just select the brush and just paint over those spots. I'll need to go back to the ink layer and select black to get rid of those specks. You don't have to worry too much about the specks. See, there's a couple here and here. These probably won't show up if you're looking at this piece from far away because they're not very big specks. But if you're really nitpicky, you can go through and paint them away. Let's continue filling in the eyes, nose, mouth layer with that same color. Again, just worry about the edge and then fill in the center using the paint bucket. The keyboard shortcut for the paint bucket is K. The shortcut for brush is B. Sometimes it's faster to use your shortcuts. I'm going to paint right along the edge, hit K on my keyboard and just fill those in. Now if I overpaint something, I can hit N to invoke the eraser tool, and I can just erase, go back to the brush with B. I think that looks pretty good. Let's go to the teeth layer and let's select white. Let's fill in those teeth. Again, I'm not going to worry about the middle of the teeth, just the edge, because that's going to save you a lot of time. Time saved on stuff like this lets you focus on adding more detail later on. We'll fill that in with the paint bucket. And now we have some basic layers for our skull. Now we can start to decorate this more. It doesn't have to be this simple. We can add all kinds of patterns and symbols and different colors to this skull. So we'll take a look at how to do that next. Let's go ahead and just do save as again to save a copy of our artwork. I'm going to call this Sugar Skull 3. That way I'll have a lot of different versions I can go back to in case something happens that I don't like. Now let's do a little bit of decorating. I'm going to select the scratchboard. I'm going to create a new layer above the ink, and I'm going to call this Deco Ink. This will be some ink for the decorations. I want to use a similar brush size, maybe a little bit smaller so this line doesn't stand out as much. I'm going to select black, and then maybe I'll do a flower in the center of the eyes. That's not uncommon to see in this kind of art. We'll add color a little bit later, but for now we'll just finish this line work. Let's do a line around the edge of the eyes here, kind of like a little border. Again, you don't have to do one solid line. You can do this in segments. And don't be afraid to use your undo, that's Ctrl Z. I'm going to add some little feather doodads here to the eyes. Try to make them all the same size, the same proportion, and have them line up. I'm going to have them get a little bit smaller where they go near the eyes there so they don't intersect with each other. And I'm going to have them kind of radiate. Now, you don't have to do this exact same design. You can, of course, do any kind of design that you want for your skull, or you can follow along just like I'm doing here. I'm just using my imagination. I've looked at some examples of other people's skulls, so I have an idea of what can be done, but I'm really just letting my mind flow here and using my imagination. When you're painting, you can use as many layers as you want. For instance, if I wanted to create another layer, I could do that. I could call it Deco Ink 2, or if I wanted to give it a more descriptive name, I could rename these layers more appropriately, like we could call this a Deco Ink 1 layer Eyes Ink. Then we could call the other layer Head Ink. Maybe this will be some decoration on the head. Then you can kind of look at your layers here and you can tell what each layer is. So on the Head Ink layer, maybe I'll add some kind of spider web kind of pattern here. And think about the contour of your skull when you're painting. This pattern is going to wrap around and follow the contour of the skull. These center lines can be a little tricky sometimes. If you don't get them perfectly straight, Sometimes holding shift will help a little bit. You can always go in and use your eraser too if it's not perfect, but we'll do that a little bit later. Might do a bit of a border on the bottom edge of this, and maybe we'll make the ends kind of like a teardrop shape. But just look for that empty space and fill it, and look for patterns and trends. Like I can fill the center of each of these objects with a little eyeball shape. The best way to learn how to improvise like this is just to doodle. Doodle all the time and you'll get really good at it. Now I think I want to clean up this line in the center. It's a bit too thick. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to select the eraser by hitting N on my keyboard. And I'm just going to erase some of that very carefully. Let's do some decoration on the nose and mouth. We can create a new layer for that, and we can call this Nose Mouth Ink. We'll select the scratchboard, and we'll zoom in here and we'll add some border to the nose. I don't want to do it too thin, but I don't want it to overlap the eyes. And we can add some lips here, just a line that follows the contour of the mouth. I'm resting my hand on my tablet so that I have a little bit of friction. That's helping me draw the line a little bit smoother. If I'm going slow, you can also look in your smoothing palette here. Smoothing is found under Window, Brush Control Panels, Smoothing. And you'll want to increase the damping to around 90%. That'll make your stroke a little bit slower and a little bit smoother. Add some little decorations here. Maybe a little tiny mustache would look kind of cool. We'll put some little decoration here on the chin as well. Now we can start focusing on adding color. Let's just clean up a few little spots here. If you see anywhere where you have some little white specks that you need to clean up, go ahead and do that. And before I forget, I want to return to that ink layer. I want to add these little lines for the teeth that I forgot to add. Let's zoom out and see how we're looking. I think that looks pretty good. Now it's up to you if you want to keep these lines all separate. We just kind of did this so there's not much risk when we're painting. But you can also just merge them together by holding Shift to select this range of layers. And you can go to Collapse Layers or hit Ctrl E on your keyboard. That'll merge all those ink layers together and you can just rename it Ink. Next, let's save a copy of our artwork by choosing Save As. I'm going to save this as 4. And you don't have to draw exclusively with symmetry. You could turn that off by clicking on the mirror painting tool, and then you can turn it on and off with this on-off switch here. I also have a little shortcut for it that's called mirror here that'll turn it off. And then you could select the scratchboard, and if you wanted to add things that are asymmetrical, you could do that. But I'm just going to leave it like this. And now we can start thinking about what colors we really want this skull to be. So I'm going to make this a little bit easier. I'm going to go to the canvas layer and I'm going to fill it with this medium gray color. That way, if we want to make our skull white, we'll be able to see the white. I'm going to select the skull layer, and then I'm going to turn on Preserve Transparency. That'll make sure that my paint stays within that pink shape that I painted earlier. And I'm going to select white, and I'm going to choose Fill. You could also hit Ctrl F on your keyboard, or you could go to Edit, Fill. Now our skull is white. Now we'll need some additional color layers here, so we can create those. Let's create one for flowers, and we can call the other one Deco. If we want, we can just group these layers together by selecting them all with Shift, and we can hit Ctrl G to group them, and we can call this group Color. That way we have our colors all together. Just makes it easier when you have a lot of layers to sort them like this. This little triangle will condense and expand your layers. So let's go to that flowers layer. Let's select a color here. Maybe we want this to be kind of a bright color like this, kind of pink fuchsia color. I'm going to use the scratchboard tool to fill that in. And I'm going to make sure that I'm using that same technique where I'm just filling along the edge and then filling the center with the paint bucket. Now you'll want to make sure that you turn mirror painting back on. I forgot to do that. And that will save you some time by not having to paint both sides. If you're filling in a color for something that's asymmetrical, then of course you would want to leave that off. Let's go to the Deco color layer. Let's pick some decoration colors. We can always change these later. These don't have to be the final colors. Now, something like this, it doesn't really make sense to paint along the edge. You may as well just kind of fill in as best you can, kind of like a coloring book. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can see this better. I'm going to fill in these areas. Now you want to make sure that your layers are stacked in the right order, because if I paint over here on the nose area, I'm actually going to paint over that blue. So I might want to move the deco layer down below the eyes, nose, mouth layer. That way that layer covers up the layer that I'm putting underneath it. It just saves me some time when I'm painting. I don't have to be as careful in those areas that are already overlapped. Now, if you wanted some of these things to be different colors, you may want to create a different layer for that color, but I want all of these decoration elements to be the same color. It doesn't have to stay this red color. I might actually change it to like yellow or gold later. But any colors that are going to be the same, that aren't really going to interfere with each other, you can put on the same layer. And you could name that layer anatomically like I've done here, or you could name it by the color. You could call it yellow or orange or red if that makes it easier for you to remember what's on that layer. Sometimes I alternate between the two depending on what makes more sense to me. In this case, I think I'm going to put these little petals around the eyes and these eyeball shapes on a separate layer. So I'm going to create a new layer for that. I'm going to call that petals eye. I really try not to get too elaborate with my titles here. It just needs to be enough to tell me what's on the layer without being a really long word or a long description. So ultimately, in the end, when you print this or when you show it online, it's just going to be a flat image. And all those layers and all that naming will be gone. So on that petals eye layer, I'm going to select a color for that. Doesn't have to be the final color. Put that in. I'm going to go back to that deco layer. I'm going to fill in this area that I forgot here that's surrounding the eyes. This can be the same color as the other colors that I chose for that layer. I'm going to return to the petals eye layer. I want to fill in these little eyeball shapes as well. Notice I'm kind of jumping around back and forth here. That's just kind of how I work. So we have all our layers filled in. And then now if we want to change the color of something, that's pretty easy to do. We can select that deco layer, for instance, turn on preserve transparency. And then we could pick a different color, like a golden color, and we could hit fill. We could fill it with that. So you could really choose any colors that you want here. If you want some inspiration for colors, you can go to a website that has a color wheel. That's found at color.adobe.com. I have a video you can watch on that if you look on my channel. And this will give us some different color schemes that we can use based on color theory. So for instance, we could choose compound, and we could pick a base color, the one with a little arrow on it's your key color. So maybe I want to make that kind of a blue-green turquoise like this. Now I can adjust these colors down here. I have this set to HSB right now, and I can adjust the brightness and the saturation and the hue. So maybe we want this to be our key color. Now these colors on either side are our complementary colors. So to get those colors into Corel Painter, I'm going to do a screen capture. You can hit the print screen key on your keyboard, or I'm going to use this snipping tool that's found in Windows. I'll click on New, and I'm going to select just those swatches there and save those. I'll save them as swatches as a PNG file. And now if I go to File, Place here in Corel Painter, I can select that swatches file, click on Open, and I can just click on OK. And I can move those swatches using the layer adjuster to somewhere where they're kind of out of the way. Let's put them up here. And then let's select our petals eye layer. Let's make sure preserve transparency is still on. Let's select the scratchboard tool. If you hold Alt on your keyboard, you can sample the color from the swatch by clicking on it. Then I'm going to use my brush to just paint over those areas just to make them that exact color of the swatch. And then I can select some of the other colors. I'm going to select this bright blue, and I'm going to make that the color of the flowers. I'm going to sample this dark blue, and I'm going to make that the color of the eyes, nose, and mouth. Just paint over the whole thing with a big brush. I'm going to select the deco layer, which was this yellow color. I'm going to select this bright red, and paint over that. You could also just use fill, that might be faster. And I'll select this kind of vermilion reddish orange color, and I'll go to the petals eye layer, and I'll paint over those top eyeball shapes. So this is the first level of shading, and we can create some additional levels of shading to make this look three-dimensional. So we're done with this first set of swatches. Let's just go ahead and hide that layer. We're done with mirror painting mode, so we can go ahead and turn that off. Let's go to the skull layer. Let's select kind of a light gray. Maybe we'll make it a little bit blue, kind of like a light blue gray like this. We'll select the scratchboard, and let's pick a side for our light source. Maybe our light source is coming from the right side of the skull. So the left side will have a little bit of a shadow like this. You want to make sure it kind of curves so it contours to the skull shape. You could add a little bit of shadow on the underside of the jaw if you like as well. And if you zoom in, you could even add little drop shadows here on your petals. Now you want to make sure that these aren't drawn symmetrically because you want your highlight and your shadow to be on opposite sides. So all these details you're going to have to put in manually. I'm going to go to the eyes, nose, mouth layer, which is this inner skull layer. I'm going to use Alt to sample this color, and I'm going to add a little bit of shading by making this color darker, and I'm going to shift the hue a little bit towards indigo. And I'm going to use a bigger brush to put in kind of a little bit of a shadow on the eyes here to make them look sunken in. I'll do the same thing for the nose layer and the mouth as well. Let's jump around a little bit and let's go to the teeth layer. And these are just filled in white for now, but we can select this same shadow color for our skull. And we can add some shading to those. Think about which side the light is on, put the shadow on the opposite side. So each tooth is kind of rounded, so you want to put in a shadow on each of them. I think that looks pretty good. Let's go to the flowers layer. Let's hold Alt to sample that blue color. Let's shift the hue a little bit towards green, and let's make it brighter. Let's add some little highlights there on the petals. Again, think about the direction of the light. Now we don't have to absolutely follow that color harmony rule. We can pick other colors that are harmonious. Like we could pick this yellow color here if we wanted to fill in the center of these flowers with yellow. We could do that because yellow is complementary to this blue. Let's go to the petals eye layer and let's do some work on these petals. Let's make this color brighter and let's shift it a little bit towards blue. I'm just going to put a highlight kind of in the center of each of these. Might make my brush a little bit smaller so it's easier to get the kind of line that I want. I want it to be kind of tapered. This is helping it look kind of glossy. Now let's go to the deco layer. That's this layer here with the red stuff on it. Let's select that color using Alt. Let's make it darker, shift it a little bit towards pink. I'm shifting my hue each time and that's going to help my color look more natural. So I'm going to add some shadow here just to the far side of this. This might not show up very well. It'll be kind of subtle, but it'll still really help this look kind of three-dimensional. Let's add a highlight. We'll sample the base color here. Let's make it a little bit brighter. Let's shift it towards orange a little bit. We'll put some little blobs here to make these look kind of three-dimensional. Let's select white and let's put a little white dot in the center. Let's go to the petals eye layer. That is these little eye shapes here. Let's sample that color using Alt to make it brighter. Let's shift the hue a little bit. Let's put in some little highlights on these. Make them look like little gems. Let's pan down a little bit and let's go to the deco layer and let's use the scratchboard tool. We'll sample this darker color that we used for the deco up here. Let's put in some big shadow kind of on the side where we added the shadow for the skull on the skull layer. That way one side is darker than the other. And then let's zoom out and let's see how we're looking. I think that looks pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and just close that group of layers there. I'm going to delete the swatches layer because I don't need that anymore. I'm going to delete the reference layer because I don't need that anymore. And then the canvas layer we can hide the eyeball for. And then you could take this skull and you could put it into another composition or print it out on a t-shirt or make stickers out of it or really do whatever you want. If you want there to be a background, you can always turn the canvas layer back on, and you could pick a background color. Like if we wanted to sample this blue-green color, we could fill the canvas with that. We can also group the ink and color layers together with Ctrl G, and we could call this skull. Let's turn off preserve transparency because we're not using that anymore. And then let's go ahead and save a copy of our artwork by choosing Save As. We'll save this as Sugar Skull 5. And let's use the layer adjuster to reposition the skull and center it. Now the beauty of this is that this is all on layers, so if you look at this a little later and you see some mistakes, which often happens because you can't see all the mistakes at once, you can always go back to these layers. Like I see there's a little speck here on the nose. It's been bothering me for a while, so I'll just go to the eyes, nose, mouth layer. I'll select the scratchboard tool. I'll sample that color with Alt, and I'll just paint over that mistake and any other mistakes that I see. But at some point you don't want to be too nitpicky about it because, again, people are going to be looking at this probably a lot smaller, like that. Here, for instance, on the ink layer, I might want to fix that by selecting black, making this come down to a point, like so. Adding a little asymmetry helps here and there to make this look a little more organic. Now at this point, if you're not going to change any of the colors around, you can just go ahead and merge these color layers with Ctrl E. And that might make it a little easier to just kind of fill in stuff and do shading on everything. For instance, if I wanted to change all of the colors uniformly now, I could go to that color layer and I could go to Effects, Tonal Control, Adjust Colors, and I could play around with the hue to get some really wild effects. Like that looks kind of cool. And of course you could change the background as well by going to the canvas layer and choosing Effects, Adjust Colors again, and that would shift it appropriately. Just make sure you pay attention to what values you choose here. I increased the saturation quite a bit too to make the colors pop a little more. I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to stick with that because I like that color scheme better. The colors are still complementary, they're just all relative to each other in a different hue. So I'm going to fix one little thing I see on the color layer here. I painted on the wrong layer earlier, so I got to fix this little blue spot. That is on the ink layer. So I'll just go through and I'll erase that with the eraser. And now it's gone. Now if we want to print this or post it on the web, we're going to need to save it appropriately. So let's go to Save As. Let's just go ahead and save this as our final master copy. If we're going to print this, then a good format is going to be the TIFF format. So we can choose Save As to save a copy. And we can choose TIFF. If you're going to be printing it without the background like so, then you would want to make sure that when you choose TIFF, Save Alpha is checked. That'll save the transparent background rather than replace it with white. That's going to merge all the layers together. That's okay. That's what we want to do. We'll click OK. And now we have a copy saved for printing. Now let's make a copy for posting on the web. You want to make sure this is around 1,000 pixels or so on either side or less. That way it won't be too big to post online. Then let's save a copy for the web. Let's go to Save As. Let's choose PNG. You could also use JPEG. Again, choose Save Alpha if you want there to be a transparent background. PNG supports transparent backgrounds while JPEG does not. So I could call this Sugar Skull Web, just so we know what it is. And now if we look in our project folder, you can see that we have our Sugar Skull print file, we have our Sugar Skull web file, and we have all of our saves along the way that we created. So there you go, that's how you can paint a sugar skull for Halloween. If you thought this video was cool, take a quick second to share it with your artist friends. And if you're new to my channel, you can subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. If you've seen my videos before and you found them helpful, consider going to patreon.com/AaronRutton and making a donation to help me continue making videos like this possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.